Ever notice how some figures from way back when they keep popping up
Oh, yeah.
in stories and movies and all
All over the place.
you name it?
Yeah.
Well, you sent us a ton of material about one of the biggest ones, Robin Hood,
Oh, yeah, I love Robin Hood.
this legendary outlaw.
Yeah.
And it's clear he just keeps fascinating us.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've got everything from scholarly articles to,
Right.
pop culture stuff. And it's all in here.
Yeah, he's one of those figures that everyone kind of knows the name.
Right.
And then when you start digging deeper, you're like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
There are so many different details. And sometimes they contradict each other.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just remarkable how the figure has been sort of reshaped and reinterpreted over the centuries.
So for anyone listening who might be new to this whole thing,
Right.
let's just get down to the basics.
Yeah.
Who are we talking about
Right.
when we say Robin Hood?
So Robin Hood, at his core,
Yeah.
is a heroic outlaw from English folklore. And he's known as a really skilled archer and swordsman.
Yeah.
You always see him depicted in that Lincoln green.
Right.
You know,
That's like his signature look.
that's him, yeah.
Yeah.
And so many people today immediately associate him with robbing from the rich to give to the poor.
Right.
But that idea, that's actually something that developed a little later in the legend's history.
Interesting. So in the beginning, it wasn't really about giving to the poor.
Not as much.
So what was the core appeal?
Well, in the earliest versions we see,
Yeah.
like in those 15th century ballads,
Okay.
he's mainly portrayed as a yeoman.
A yeoman now.
Yeah, so think of a yeoman as like a commoner,
Okay.
but not the lowest of the low.
Right. Right.
Not a peasant, but not a knight.
Gotcha.
Somewhere in between.
Okay.
And these early stories, they emphasize his support for the less fortunate.
Oh.
He's always shown as having a lot of respect for women
Uh-huh.
and also devotion to the Virgin Mary.
Okay.
He's also incredible with a bow and arrow.
Of course. Right.
And you can definitely see that rebellious streak in him.
Yeah.
That goes against the established church. And also his ongoing conflict with the Sheriff of Nottingham.
So some of these elements we still see today.
Absolutely.
You know, the amazing archer, the
Yeah.
sheriff is the villain.
Yeah.
But the idea of social justice, that seems to come a little later.
Yeah, it kind of evolves over time.
Yeah, and you mentioned his social standing.
Right.
Was he always seen as a commoner in these tales?
Not always.
Oh, really?
So while those early ballads firmly place him as like a yeoman,
Yeah.
starting around the 16th century,
Okay.
there were efforts to elevate his status.
Oh, interesting.
And you see some later stories portraying him as being of noble birth.
Okay.
Some even say he was the Earl of Huntingdon,
The Earl of Huntingdon, wow.
or like a crusader returning home to find that his lands had been taken.
Oh, wow.
So there's not really one official version of the story.
Right.
It's really fascinating because it's been adapted so many times over the years to reflect different social and political climates.
Right.
So sometimes you see him depicted as this kind of libertarian
Okay.
fighting against unfair taxes,
Uh-huh.
and other times almost as an early socialist,
Yeah.
advocating for wealth redistribution.
That is a huge range.
Yeah, it is.
From a commoner to an earl.
Right.
From libertarian to socialist.
Yeah,
So it just shows how flexible the legend has become.
right.
Now, what about the other familiar faces that we see in these stories, who are like the supporting characters?
So over time, a fairly consistent group has kind of emerged.
Okay.
You've got Maid Marian.
Right.
Often she's depicted as his romantic partner,
Yeah.
sometimes his wife.
Okay.
And then you've got his band of outlaws,
Yeah.
famously known as the Merry Men.
The Merry Men, of course.
And then, of course, his main adversary, the Sheriff of Nottingham,
Right.
was often depicted as being in league with the villainous Prince John
Right.
and acting against the absent King Richard.
Ah, King Richard. So the whole historical setting that we usually associate with Robin Hood,
Right,
that also developed over time.
exactly.
Okay.
So while Robin Hood gained popularity in the late Middle Ages,
Yeah.
the connection to Richard the Lionheart and Prince John,
Yeah.
that really took hold in the 16th century.
Okay.
However,
Yeah.
and this is really important,
Okay.
the earliest ballads, they don't support this setting
Oh, wow.
in the time of Richard Iles.
Okay.
In fact, the Guest of Robin Hood, which is an early collection of these tales,
Okay.
it specifically names the king as Edward.
Edward.
Interesting.
So scholars, they generally believe that the older ballads, they were probably set somewhere in the 13th or 14th centuries.
Okay.
But there's not really a strict historical timeline within the ballads themselves.
Gotcha. So we have a sense now of the core legend
Yeah.
and how it's changed.
Yeah.
So let's look at some of those early ballads.
Okay.
Those 15th and 16th century stories.
Yeah.
What do we learn about Robin Hood from those? Well, the very first mention we have of Robin Hood
Okay.
comes even before the surviving ballads.
Okay.
In the 1370s,
Okay.
there's a poem called Piers Plowman,
Okay.
and it mentions rhymes of Robin Hood.
Okay, so he was already known.
Right? He was already out there.
Yeah.
And then at the turn of the 15th century,
Okay.
you start seeing proverbs and even religious writings that were complaining
Oh, really?
about how popular his stories were becoming.
Okay.
But the oldest actual narrative ballads that we have,
Right.
they date from the late 15th and early 16th centuries.
Okay.
That's when we really start to see those stories emerge.
And you mentioned some recurring themes
Yes.
in those for us.
So beyond his support for the lower classes
Yeah.
and his impressive archery skills,
Right.
there's also a really notable respect for women and a strong devotion to the Virgin Mary.
Okay.
The anti-clerical sentiment is also really interesting, as is the constant hostility that's directed towards the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Right.
And we also see the early appearances of some of his well-known companions,
Okay.
like Little John,
Yeah.
much of the Engeland son,
Right.
and Will Scarlet, who was initially referred to as Will Scarlock or Scathelock.
Well, Scarlock or Scathelock.
Right.
Interesting.
But Mate Marian and Friar Tuck,
Right.
they joined the narrative a bit later.
So not the whole gang was there from the beginning.
No, not at all.
So it really does show how it grew over time.
Yeah, organically.
Now, what about this whole idea of him being a loyal follower of Richard the Lionheart?
Right.
You mentioned that that came later.
Yeah, that's not in those early ballads at all.
Wow. Okay.
So the idea that he was a contemporary of Richard
Uh-huh.
and that he was like a devoted supporter of Richard while he was away on the Third Crusade,
Great.
that just doesn't appear.
Oh, okay.
And as we discussed, the guest actually names King Edward.
Right. Edward.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the oldest surviving ballad that we have, Robin Hood and the Monk,
Okay.
that offers even less support for this idea of a true king. Yeah.
That's just not there.
Interesting. And how about his social standing
Yeah.
in these early tales?
Right.
Was he kind of a rough and tumble commoner?
Well, the early ballads, they're very clear.
Okay.
Robin Hood is a yeoman.
Yeah.
And while the definition of yeoman, it kind of changed over time.
Right.
But in this context,
Yeah.
it generally meant he was a commoner.
Okay.
He wasn't a knight.
Yeah.
But also not a peasant.
Okay.
Somewhere in between.
Gotcha.
And interestingly,
Uh-huh.
Robin Hood in these early texts can actually be quite a bit rougher.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's not always this idealized hero like we often see him today.
Uh-huh.
So there are actually instances where he's shown to have a really quick temper,
Okay.
even acting violently.
Wow.
Like in one ballad, he assaults Little John.
Oh, wow.
And in Robin Hood
Right.
and the Monk Much the Miller's Son,
Okay.
he rather casually kills a young page.
Wow. So he's not so heroic.
Right. He's a little rough around the edges
Yeah.
in these early versions. Interesting.
And definitely a much different Robin Hood than you see in some of those later, more sanitized versions.
Big contrast to
Yeah.
that heroic image we usually have now.
Right.
So what about robbing the rich to give to the poor?
Yeah.
When does that appear?
Well, this is actually a really important point.
Okay.
No early ballad actually depicts Robin Hood as systematically redistributing wealth.
Okay.
However, in a jest of Robin Hood,
Okay.
he does make a really significant interest-free loan
Okay.
to a poor knight,
Okay.
and he states his intention to give to poor travelers.
Okay.
But the first clear statement we have of him robbing the wealthy to help the poor,
Right.
that actually comes much later
Okay.
in John Stow's Annals of England.
Annals of England.
It was published in 1592.
Wow. Okay.
So it's like a century after the jest was first printed.
So the seeds of the idea were there,
Yeah, they're there.
but it takes a while
Yeah, it takes quite a while.
to really become the central theme.
It does, yeah.
Interesting. What else do you think stands out about these early ballads?
Well, one thing that stands out to me
Yeah.
is the emphasis on courtesy and a certain social order within Robin's band.
Okay.
So his men are often seen kneeling before him as like a sign of obedience.
Okay.
And this kind of reflects this medieval sense of hierarchy
Uh-huh.
rather than like the more egalitarian ideals
Right.
that we might associate with him today.
Yeah.
And their yeoman status is also reflected in their choice of weapons.
Okay.
They primarily use swords.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So not the quarterstaff.
Not yet. So the quarterstaff,
Okay.
which we so often see in like the later stories and in films.
Yeah, you always see him with a quarterstaff.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That doesn't really become a thing until the 17th century ballads.
This is swords, not quarterstaffs.
Yeah.
Another image that's really shifted over time.
It has.
Now, I imagine scholars have different interpretations, all of these ballads tell us,
They do.
about the time.
Yeah, so there's actually been a long debate among scholars.
Okay.
Some like J.C. Holt.
Okay.
He's argued that the Robin Hood legend actually originated within gentry households.
Okay.
So not really as a form of peasant rebellion.
Interesting.
So he points out that Robin himself is a yeoman
Right.
and a peasant.
Yeah.
And the ballads, they don't really focus on like typical peasant grievances,
Okay.
like oppressive taxes or things like that.
Okay.
Instead, Holt suggests that Robin embodies these traditional values of generosity and piety.
Okay.
And he's actually opposing those who are seen as greedy and worldly.
So a different take
Yeah.
than what we usually think of.
Yeah.
But there's another viewpoint as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
So other scholars, they emphasize those more rebellious aspects
Yeah.
of the early ballads,
Uh-huh.
and they view them as a form of popular literature that in its own way
Right.
challenged the feudal system.
Okay, so two main ways to think about this?
Yeah. Two main schools of thought
Yeah.
on the social implications.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Now, our outline also mentions May Day games
Right.
and early plays.
Yeah.
So how did those contribute to the Robin Hood legend?
Well, by at least the early 15th century,
Okay.
Robin Hood had become very closely linked with May Day celebrations.
May Day.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we even have records of people dressing up as Robin and his merry men for these festivities.
Really?
Yeah. And in some areas,
Mm-hmm.
this tradition continued for a really long time
Wow.
and even became briefly popular at court
Oh, wow.
during the reign of Henry VIII.
Interesting.
So Robin often played the role of a May King,
Okay.
leading games and processions.
Uh-huh.
And there were also plays featuring the Robin Hood characters
Okay.
that were performed during these events.
So this is where Maid Marian and Friar Tuck come in.
That's the general theory.
Okay.
So it's believed that Maid Marian and a jovial friar, who we now know as Friar Tuck,
Right.
most likely entered the legend through these May games.
Okay.
And there's a connection to French May festivities
Okay.
that featured a Robin and Marian figure.
Okay.
So while the French play Jeux de Robin et Marion,
Right.
it is a separate work.
Okay.
It's very likely that the names and those basic roles traveled to England
Okay.
and then merged with that already existing Robin Hood tradition.
So they might have had their own origins
They probably did, yeah.
and then become part of the same story.
Exactly, yeah.
Now we actually have some fragments of those early play scripts,
We do.
right, that
And
have survived.
We do.
So what are those?
So the earliest preserved fragment is called Robin Hood and the Shrife off Nottingham.
Robin Hood and the Shrife off Nottingham.
Okay, and this dates back to the 1470s.
Wow.
And it's really important because it shows that Robin Hood was already part of these May Day rituals.
Okay.
And it actually includes one of the earliest mentions of Friar Tuck.
Oh, wow.
We also have an early playtext included in a 1560 printed edition of The Guest. And this includes dramatic versions of Robin Hood and the Curtal Friar,
Okay.
and a section of Robin Hood and the Potter.
Okay.
But what's interesting is the publisher actually seemed to think it was all one play,
Oh, wow.
intended for May games,
Okay.
not realizing that it actually contained two separate pieces.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So these May Day celebrations
right.
really were important
Yeah, they were really important.
in expanding the story and
Absolutely.
introducing new characters.
Right, and then you have the invention of printing and the rise of broadside ballads.
Right, right.
So how did that affect things?
So printing obviously was a huge change.
Oh, yeah, it was a huge shift
Yeah.
in how the Robin Hood legend was transmitted.
Right.
So broadside ballads,
Yeah.
which were essentially single printed sheets,
Okay.
became the main way
Right.
that these stories were shared.
Okay.
And while we don't know the exact timeline,
Yeah.
it seems like this transition was pretty much complete by the end of the 16th century. And it's interesting, around this same time,
Okay.
an unpublished prose life of Robin Hood was written,
Wow.
and it drew heavily on the guest.
Okay.
But it also showed that the author was familiar with these early broadside ballads.
Okay.
And these broadsides, they were cheaply printed.
Right.
They often featured really simple woodcut illustrations.
Yeah,
And this made the stories much more accessible to a wider audience
of course.
than those earlier oral traditions.
So what were these broadside ballads like?
Well, they were often adaptations of older ballad verses
Okay.
and frequently set to a limited number of popular tunes,
Okay.
which sometimes resulted in them being a little bit repetitive.
Oh, okay.
Common themes in these broadsides
Uh-huh.
included Robin Hood's contests with various tradesmen,
Okay.
like tinkers and tanners and butchers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So different tradesmen.
Yeah,
Well,
and scholars have noted that Robin Hood in these broadsides,
yeah.
he's generally portrayed as less tragic,
Okay.
less heroic,
Uh.
and perhaps a little less complex
Right.
than that medieval figure we see in the earlier ballads.
So maybe a simplification.
Yeah, maybe a bit of the
It's
character.
to reach that wider audience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they did actually introduce the character of Alan a Dale.
Not Dale.
Yeah, in the 17th century.
Okay.
And he, unlike some other later editions,
Uh-huh.
has really remained a part of the Robin Hood narrative.
So he's stuck.
He did, yeah.
Now, the outline also mentions these things called garlands.
Yeah.
What were those?
So in the 18th and 19th centuries,
Okay.
Robin Hood ballads were frequently sold
Okay.
in collections known as garlands.
Garlands. Okay.
And these were essentially these small, inexpensive chapbooks
Okay.
aimed at like a more working class audience.
Okay.
And while they didn't really add a lot of new material
Right.
to the core legend,
Uh-huh.
they played a really important role
Okay.
in ensuring its continued popularity.
Okay.
After the single broadside ballad became less common.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to note
Uh-huh.
that during the 18th century, Robin Hood would sometimes appear in criminal biographies
Oh, wow.
and histories of famous highwaymen.
Really?
Yeah, so kind of blurring the lines between folklore
Oh, that's interesting.
and true crime.
Yeah.
So the legend was constantly being reshaped
Right.
and repackaged
Yeah.
for different audiences at
Lovely.
different times.
Absolutely. So let's move on to this rediscovery phase
Okay.
in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
How did that influence our modern understanding of Robin Hood?
Well, this period saw this renewed scholarly and popular interest in those older ballads.
Okay.
So you have Thomas Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry,
Okay.
which was published in 1765,
Okay.
and that included previously unpublished ballads like Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne,
Okay.
which are now considered to be genuinely late medieval
Wow.
in origin.
Okay.
But the really pivotal work
Yeah.
was Joseph Ritson's Robin Hood, a collection of all the ancient poems, songs, and ballads now extant.
Okay, what made Ritson's collection so influential?
Well, it was published in 1795,
Okay.
and it provided this readily available source book
Yeah.
for poets and novelists
Okay.
who were looking to kind of reimagine the Robin Hood legend.
Uh-huh.
His collection included The Guest,
Okay.
and it brought Robin Hood and the Potter back into print for the first time.
Wow.
While he did miss Robin Hood and the Monk,
Okay.
it was published very shortly thereafter.
Okay.
And Ritson's own interpretation of Robin Hood was really crucial
Okay.
in solidifying this modern concept
Yeah.
of him stealing from the rich to give to the poor.
Great.
So Ritson himself was a supporter of the French Revolution,
Okay.
and he viewed Robin Hood as this genuinely heroic figure from history
Uh-huh.
who stood up against tyranny.
Okay.
However, it's worth noting that Ritson's own very radical political views,
Right.
they likely influenced his portrayal of the outlaw hero.
So he maybe reconstructed Robin a little
Yeah, maybe a bit.
in his own image?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And did this Ritson collection inspire any other works?
Oh, absolutely. Like,
Yeah.
what do we see?
So Sir Walter Scott,
Right.
he was actually friends with Ritson.
Wow.
And he used Ritson's anthology as the primary source
Okay.
for his portrayal of Robin Hood in his famous novel Ivanhoe,
Ivanhoe.
which was published in 1818.
Okay.
And this novel was so influential
Right.
in shaping the modern Robin Hood legend, particularly in establishing that element of conflict between the Saxons and the Normans.
Yeah.
And later in the 19th century,
Uh-huh.
we also see the rise of adaptations that were aimed at children.
Okay. Okay.
And Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood
Okay.
became hugely popular and really further cemented the image of Robin as this philanthropic outlaw.
So by the 19th century, we're getting close to the Robin Hood we recognize today.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're getting there.
This noble Saxon, right?
Fighting for the common people against Norman oppression.
Right. And authors like Augustine Thierry and Walter Scott,
Right.
they really championed this idea of Robin Hood as a Saxon resisting Norman rule. Which really added a whole new layer to the legend.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the 20th century.
Right.
And beyond.
Yeah.
How has the legend continued to evolve?
Well, the 20th century added even more layers to the story.
Okay.
You have the 1938 film The Adventures of Robin Hood,
Yeah.
starring Errol Flynn.
Of course.
Which was incredibly influential.
Right.
And it presented Robin as this national hero,
Yeah.
leading this Saxon revolt against Norman overlords,
Right.
while King Richard was away. And that film was so popular.
Yeah.
And it really shaped much of the popular imagery and understanding of Robin Hood that followed.
Right.
And we've even seen completely new elements
really?
introduced in modern adaptations.
Like what?
So, for example, in films and television since the 1980s.
You see things like the inclusion of Muslim merrymen.
Muslim merrymen, wow, that's
Yeah.
a big change.
It is.
From early ballads.
It is reflecting this more contemporary understanding of inclusivity and diversity.
So really showing how the legend adapts
It does.
to times.
It does.
Now, the big question,
Right.
did Robin Hood actually exist?
The historicity of Robin Hood
Yes,
has been debated for centuries.
of course.
And it's a really complex issue.
Yeah.
One of the main challenges
Yeah.
is that Robert, and its common shortened form, Robin,
Right,
were extremely popular names in medieval England,
right.
as was the surname Hood.
Uh-huh.
And so we find a ton of historical records from this time
Okay.
that mention individuals with these names.
Right.
And some of them were indeed known criminals.
Okay.
But there's also a theory that the name Hood might have actually been a dialect term for someone who lived in the woods.
Oh, interesting.
So Robin Hood could simply mean Robin of the Wood.
Robin of the Wood.
Yeah.
Okay.
And interestingly, early references from like 1261 onwards
Okay.
show that Robin Hood
Okay.
was actually used as a nickname for various outlaws.
So it might have been the more general term for a bandit
Exactly.
rather than an actual person?
Yeah, possibly.
Okay, interesting. What else?
So Andrew of Wintown's Original Chronicle,
Okay.
which was written around 1420,
Okay.
mentions Little John and Robbe Hud.
Little John.
Okay.
Yeah. Interesting. As Waithmen.
Waithmen.
Yeah, or outlaws.
Okay.
Operating in the late 13th century.
Okay.
And a parliament petition from 1439
Okay.
uses Robin Hood's name to describe a wandering criminal
Okay.
and compares him to Robin Hood and his mane.
Robin Hood and his mane.
Yeah, meaning like his company or
Yeah.
followers.
Gotcha.
And the Scotichronicon,
Right.
which was written around 1440,
Okay.
portrays Robert Hood
Okay.
as being alive
Okay.
during the time of Simon de Montfort.
Simon de Montfort.
Mhm.
Yeah. In the mid-13th century.
Okay.
And then a note written in the margin of a copy of
Or
Polychronicon
the Chronicon, okay.
around 1460
Okay.
mentions Robin Hood as an outlaw in Sherwood Forest
Okay.
during the reign of King Edward I.
So all these different mentions.
Yeah, they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Scattered across a couple of centuries.
But nothing definite
Right.
pointing to one person.
Right. No smoking gun.
Now, have any specific people been put forward as the real Robin Hood?
There have been a few. So one early candidate is a Robert Hawhala of York.
Okay.
His possessions were confiscated in 1226,
Okay.
and he is recorded as becoming an outlaw.
Okay.
And he appears in legal records for several years,
Okay.
but there's no direct evidence
Mm-hmm.
linking him to the kind of banditry
Right.